You're listening to Artistic Finance, show 176. On today's show, theater designers and their agents come together for an in-depth discussion on navigating agent-designer relationships, contract negotiations, and strategies for fair compensation in the theater industry. We discuss preparing for contract negotiations, challenges and solutions when negotiating, meeting and building relationships with agents, and advice for early, mid-career, and high-profile designers. Now, I know that there are a lot of episodes in which I say this is the best episode we've had, but this time I really do think this is the best episode we've ever put out. Now, part of that is because we're covering a lot of types of designers, not just my usual hankering for lighting designers. Now, let me start by saying a big thank you to this panel. Both the designers and the agents jumped in and helped me put this together. And truth be told, I don't think a discussion like this has ever happened, at least not with this many people and not with the variety of designers. But wow, am I glad that we did this, because we really are shedding a light on the important role that agents play in advocating for designers and for designers advocating for themselves. A couple notes about this discussion. My microphone stopped working shortly into it, and so you're going to hear a very tinny version of me. And also, this panel consisted of 8 people, and that brought an amazing wealth of advice and experience, but 90 minutes was not enough time for meaningful back and forth or any alternative perspectives. So for that, I ask for forgiveness from the panel and also from you, the listener. Nonetheless, I find this a very valuable conversation. Contact information for each of our guests is included in the show notes or at artisticfinance.com/176. That's also where you can get the patron link for this episode, and that includes a PDF of the pros and cons for designers working with agents. Mostly pros, as there aren't really any negatives. That PDF is meant to be a classroom supplement if you bring up this topic in any of your classes. Without further ado, let's get to the show.
You are listening to Artistic Finance, where we help creatives learn about the business of show business.
Welcome, everyone, to those joining us here on the panel. Thank you for being here and giving us your time. And to those of you joining us via the podcast or on YouTube, thank you for listening in. So we're here to discuss how theater designers work with agents. And the instigation for this came from a previous episode we did with a panel of lighting designers where we were discussing pay negotiations. And a lot of those answers involved working with an agent. So I thought, well, let's chat with the agents too. And so some of these questions we're going to answer today are from early career designers. Some are from students, and then some of them are from me. And there's a lot of us here in the room. So let's go around and introduce ourselves. We have several designers that are paired with their agents. So I'm going to ask you to say a lot this first time you talk. And so designers, tell us what type of designer you are, what your home base is, and how long you've been designing. Then agents, let us know what agency you're with, your home base, your market, and then how long you've been an agent. And then a bonus question of if you remember the first time that you negotiated a contract through an agent, or if you're an agent, the first time you negotiated a contract for a theater designer. Okay, and I'm going to start with Daniela Hart.
Well, my name is Daniela Hart. I am a sound designer and composer. My home base is New York. I'm up here in Harlem. I have been working, I think as a sound designer for about 10 years now. But I've been working with Jack for 3 years?
3 years.
3 magical years. First time I negotiated, I think outside of some that were already negotiated for us through Yale, we negotiated for a contract for an amazing children's show. And it was interesting. We did not know what we were doing, I would definitely say. And man, we've come a long way since. But I want to speak to who we is, of course. My name is Daniela Hart, but I also work under the company Uptown Works, where I work with two other designers, Noelle Nichols and Bailey Trierweiler. We often work as one designer under one design fee, although sometimes we'll expand that and work as assistants to each other or production audio to each other to really maximize on what we can do with the contract and support the show. We work as a bit of a collective in that way. And so I think, we've made Jack his job very difficult sometimes, but it also just speaks to the efficacy of working with an agent, I would say, because we are very unique. So we're a little bit weird, I would say. And so it's really amazing being able to work with Jack because of our unique collective.
All right, Jack, how about you?
Hi, I'm Jack. Well, first off, it is such a pleasure to represent a collective and to have sort of a unique, strange representation situation of three people as one. It's been a lovely experience to kind of dive into that world. I am an agent at CPK Artists. I first started working at a talent agency January of 2020, which was a really interesting time to start. And then I started taking on clients a little over 3 years ago. Uptown Works is one of my early signs, and it's been a pleasure to work with them from there. And I'm based in Brooklyn, New York.
Awesome. All right, let's jump over to Jason Lynch.
Hi, Jason Lynch. I am based in Chicago. I'm a lighting designer. I've been here for about 9 years, which is insane. Skyler it's been about 3.5 years. It was sort of also wrapped into that pandemic craziness of wondering what was next and sort of took that leap. And it's great. One of the earlier contracts, I feel like it was all like COVID related and like safety, of course. Because I was pretty fortunate to get an opportunity to work at a theater out of town. And so it was just negotiating what that meant in the time of COVID, I think in 2021. And yeah, it's been great. Skyler's great. So yeah.
Awesome. Skyler, hello.
Hello. Well, thank you, Jason. Skyler Gray. I work at the Gersh agency. I've been here. I just hit 5 years. Which is crazy because I worked in nonprofit theater for 10 before coming to the dark side. And Jason was the first designer I started working with. We like almost crossed paths about 20 different times in Chicago when I lived there. So it's a lot of fun to work with him in this capacity. I don't actually remember the first contract because I feel like we did about 10 COVID contracts all at once. And part was sort of adjusting them for when they came back. Some were figuring out what to do when they sort of evaporated. But it was we really dove into the deep end and it was a lot of fun and it's been a great journey.
All right, let's jump over to Johanna Pan.
Hi, I'm Johanna. I'm a costume and scenic designer. I'm currently based in New York and Singapore, so I do work in both countries as well as sometimes other places as well. I've been working since 2013 and I've been Lucy since 2022. I basically was working on a production where I realized I wasn't getting paid as much as everyone else. And because of that, I reached out to Lucy because I had met her working downtown in a tiny little show called Between the Threads, where she was a dramaturg. And I had remembered that she had moved into being an agent. And so I reached out to her and the rest is history.
All right. Lucy Powis.
Hi, I'm Lucy Powis. I'm an agent at Michael Moore Agency. I started at A3, or what was Abrams Artist Agency, at the beginning of 2019. So have been in the agency side of the business for about 5.5 years. But to the point of what the first contract I negotiated for a designer was, I started taking on clients in June 2020. So as others have mentioned, I really started with COVID contracts and remember that the first designer contract I negotiated was for the reuse of a designer's designs in an opera that had been done live and was being streamed. So very much started in that world.
All right, let's jump to Cookie Jordan.
Hi, I'm Cookie Jordan. I am a hair wig designer and I've been in this profession for over 40 years. What's the other question? How long I've been with Russ? Russ, I just looked it up.
I don't know.
It's almost 14 years. Russ
Fela,
is
right?
doing Fela on Broadway. It was transferring to the National, and the costume designer, Marina
Draghici. Yep.
said, Cookie, don't negotiate this contract by yourself, which I did for the Broadway. You need an agent. So she goes, I have a great agent. I'll introduce you to my agent. And I want to say to people, introduce people to your agent. It's not a big secret. Introduce people to your agent. Help young people get agents. So she introduced me to Russ. And now I just say, could you contact my agent? And that's the way it is.
That's awesome. Cookie, follow-up question, which is, for that Fela, was that the first time you used an agent? Did you never have one before that?
I had an agent before that, but he wasn't an agent. He was a lawyer.
Mm.
I did the tour of High School Musical, and Disney said, if you want this job, you get yourself an agent or a lawyer. We do not talk to the artists directly. So
Awesome.
I got him, and it was just very sort of like, yeah, I had to keep track of how much to pay him because he'd never had an artist. And it was like, oh, I think you owe me. And it was just getting kind of weird. So now I know how much I pay.
Okay, awesome. All right, Russ, hello.
Hi. So I am the founder and the managing partner of Summit Entertainment Group. It's my baby. I started it I'm an old dog, 35 years ago. The reason why I started it, and some of you people are Yale drama school people, I went from the drama school, done with not-for-profit, went right to Joe Harris's office. It was a general manager on Broadway in the 80s. There was a flop in the 80s. I managed it. I was a company manager, all of that. I got a phone call 3 years in from a friend of mine who was designing the lighting for August Wilson's Fences at the Yale Rep. She said, great news. My show's moving to Broadway. I go, wow, Danny, and that's really fabulous. She says, so they're going to pay me 50% of my originating fee. And I said to her, you were a student. You had no originating fee. They're paying you 50% of nothing, which is nothing. That's wrong. She said, well, Ben Mordecai told me. Ben Mordecai at the time, God rest his soul, was the managing director at the Yale Rep, was a professor of mine when I was at Yale, and was the general manager and the producer of Fences. She goes, oh, I'm not going back to Ben. I can't tell him he's wrong. I said, yeah, you can. And she said, how about you do it? So I was like, I'm in this general management office doing all these contracts, learning the back end. So I went up to my main boss and I said, hey, Joe, Fences is moving to Broadway. I have this friend, you know her. She comes in and has lunch with me. Can I negotiate a contract? He goes, you know what? We are not repping anybody on it. We're not managing it. We're not producing it. Go for it. The only thing you need to do is make sure you get 10%. I was like, okay. I went back to her. I said, I need 10%. She said, fine. And guess what happened? The set designer called, and the costume designer called, and the sound designer called. And that started Summit Entertainment Group. It was a while before I could afford to actually leave my day job to be an agent, because back then the royalty was $60 a week. 10% of that, $6. You pay a bookkeeper, you put the stamp on it. But it's morphed, and I'm very lucky because now I get to rep so many people, a lot who are not in United Scenic Artists, like Cookie, right? Which we could talk about later, but that's my story. Oh, and if I was a boy, my name would have been Jeff with a G. So Russ is my given name. There you go.
That's awesome. That's
I
amazing.
talk too much. I'm from the Bronx. Okay, I'll mute.
No, it's great. It's great. It's a permanent problem with theater people. And also it was great. It was great. All right. So I'm going to skip the next question, which was how did you meet your designer and agent? Because I feel like we covered that a lot. For the rest of the questions, for the sake of time, I have picked a specific designer or agent that I'm going to ask that question of, but I'm not trying to be keeping anybody out if you have anything to say. So if you have something to add, just jump in and add it whenever that person finishes the answer. So let's just start here. I'm going to assign this question to Jack. And this is a question from Alexandra in San Diego. And the question is, what do you look for in a designer when designing whether to represent them?
It's a great question. I think it's something that almost every early career person asks themselves, how do I position myself to get on an agent's roster? For me, I think there's kind of two categories of things that I look for. There's the objective, more concrete things and the more mercurial subjective stuff. The concrete stuff for me is really, who do you know? Where have you worked? What are your skills? All of the sort of like basic barriers to entry. The more people that someone knows or the more people that they've associated for, the more likelihood of them to sort of move up the ladder of the industry. So that's sort of an easy side of things. Just the more you've worked, the more people you know. I think the more subjective thing is that obviously this is all about art making and it's all subjective. It's all about aesthetics and taste and vibes. And, different agents have different tastes, different, types of people that they like to represent. So it's really kind of a person to person thing. But I think the most subjective thing that I think is actually the most important is the personal connection that you have with the agent. Sometimes you meet with someone and you just know like you don't get along. The person's talented, but there's not a connection there. The thing that I gravitate most toward is, do I like the person? If I'm going to represent, for example, Uptown Works, I looked this morning, we've done 60 or 70 contracts together over the course of the last 3 years. If we didn't like each other, it would be really hard to do 60 or 70 agreements together. So, it sounds so silly and sort of flippant, but that's really I think the principal thing is, do I like this person? And then do I think that they have talent and potential and all of that other stuff?
To echo your point there, Jack, about getting along with the agent, is Cookie and Russ were the first people in the Zoom room, and it was like chitter immediately. So they clearly get along really well. All right, so this next question is for Jason. Question from Aiden in Boston. How do you evaluate whether an agent is a good fit for you?
Oh, that's a great question. Actually, to what Jack was speaking about, I think it's about making sure that it's more about like outside of the work, right? It's an engagement in what's happening in the industry it's been important to me. An engagement as in sort of following what I want to do in my path. Skyler has been great about keeping me on track, about knowing that we're in a place to make progress, right? And not accept every job, which is really hard for me. And I'm sure like the last 3 years have been probably really putting a lot of hair out for Skyler, because my loyalty to whoever or whatever means that I will say yes to everything. But having Skyler as my agent to be like, remember the big picture here about, your health and your well-being and like where you want to be in 5, 10, 15 years, and making sure you're staying on track with that has been one of the really big benefits of having an agent for me. And like, I think about that every time an interest and availability comes in. It's like, what would Skyler say? It's just like, and like, where have we, the journey that we've been on for the last 3 years has been quite insane. And I always have to speak about like, with the social justice and how the push to diversify really like propelled my career in 2020, 2021. And so I feel like everything in my life has been a bit of an anomaly because of what happened in the last 3 years. And like having Skyler there as sort of just like on a personal level to sort of keep me level headed has been really important. So I can
Okay.
keep going, but that's
Yeah. Oh, like a logistical question of how were you introduced to Sky? Like, did you like look up Sky before you talked with him or said
Oh,
yes?
the other anomaly. So this was in 2021. I was in a production meeting with a with a friend and client that someone that Skylar represents, and it was at a time where we didn't know what the future was going to hold, and we were in these meetings, and constantly things were being canceled and moved and delayed. And so I get a private message during a design meeting from a director friend that says, "Do you have an agent?" Like literally, and she said, "We're gonna get you one." And then she connected me with Skylar. Skylar and I chatted, and then we sort of just like ran off into like the COVID contracts, and it was great. It was great. So
Awesome. Awesome. All right. This next question is for Lucy from Jaden in Phoenix. Can you describe a time when you had to advocate for a designer's interests in a difficult situation? And by difficult situation, I think mostly maybe a disconnect between the designer and the production. How did you handle it?
Yes, I have to talk about this sort of vaguely to keep the identities of those involved protected. But I was working with a designer a number of years ago who had a job that they were very excited about. It was probably the highest level job they'd had. And they called me a few weeks into rehearsal, very upset, saying, I don't think the director's happy with me. I'm worried that I'm going to lose this job, but I think I am being mistreated by this director. I think that the unhappiness that they have with me is coming from an unfair place. And I think there are versions of this story where I end up talking it through with the client, and the client ends up talking to the director or to the theater. There are different ways this could have gone, but in this particular situation, it was so emotional and so difficult that the designer's preference was for me to be involved as a third party. So I ended up calling the theater and expressing what had happened. They echoed that, yes, the director was unhappy and that, there had been discussions about what that would mean. But I think the added context from the designer's point of view was something that the theater didn't have. And so the theater ended up being really instrumental in, I think, mending bridges. And again, I have to be sort of vague about how things ended up, but I think they ended up in a much better place. And in this case, it was helpful for this designer to have that third party person able to express what was happening and what had been a very difficult situation, and to not have to do that, and to make sure that the theater had all the context so that they could help mediate moving forward as well.
And had you been this person's agent for a while at this point?
Yes, this was not our first contract, which I think is also, that is something that can only be built over time with clients, that I certainly hope that I will be the person that they call if they're having a tough time. But of course, if you don't know each other as well, that can be difficult. And the beauty of working with people for a long time is that you start to build up that trust and that knowledge of each other that can help you in situations like that.
This next question is for Cookie, and this is a question from Ethan in New York, not me. What does an agent actually do? / what are some misconceptions that designers have about what agents do?
What they do for me, what Russ does for me is she is the first contact to the producers. Someone will send me an interest and availability, and my response is always, could you please contact my agent, Russ? So from that point on, I don't really talk to producers. Okay, I think it's really good because any questions, any concerns, Russ will say, Cookie, how many wigs are in that show? Are they going to give, how many people do you think you need to run that show? She doesn't get into the vending part because I make the wigs. But she's the first contact to say, that show has 70 wigs. You can't possibly pay her $2,000 to design it. And it's not personal because it's not coming from me talking to them, because I used to do that. And sometimes this physicality of myself, being almost 6 feet tall and a Black woman, people get intimidated. And all I'm saying is, I need more money. But when she handles it, it's totally different. One of the misconceptions I think that people, young designers, have about agents is that they find you work. That's not her job to find you work. I find my own work. and then she negotiates that contract. And another thing that I will say, if your agent knows that you will say no, then they're in a good place to negotiate for you. But if they know you're saying that's not enough money, but in the end, you're going to take it anyway, it's a waste of her time. Then just take it. That's how I feel.
Awesome. And just a little bit of a follow-up there, which is the agent doesn't get you work. Is it usually the directors that are getting you the work and you have a conversation with the director and then
No, people, as far as hair and makeup, my work comes from costume designers who say, I'm designing this show and I want Cookie to do the wigs. Sometimes I have a couple of relationships with a couple of writers who always like for me to do their shows. That's rare. But I've known them since they were in before they graduated from Yale. And then I have some directors who would like to hire me before the costume designer is hired. And that's where Russ comes in and she will explain. I'll say, Russ, it's a bad position to put me in to tell some costume designer that they get me. They may have someone they've been working with. So it's kind of nice to have an agent because Russ always says, who is the costume designer? Is this offer coming from the director, the writer? The costume designer is totally different.
Okay. Follow up to that, Russ, just because this is a unique situation that I have never really thought about. In that situation where someone's hiring the wig designer before the costume designer, potentially, are you then reaching out to the producer or GM, or are you reaching out to the costume designer?
It usually comes in as an offer, and you don't know how she gets an interest and availability check or an offer, and I look at it and I go, well, I love the offers. You've probably all gotten them when there's no director, no name of the play, no dates. And they just say, hey, we open, and you look at it and go, hello, more information, right? So I say to Cookie, well, do you know anything about this? Like maybe she has a heads up about it. Maybe she knew about it. She goes, I know nothing. I haven't heard anything. So I'll reach out to the GM or the person that did the interest and availability check. It might be a production manager at a regional theater or whatever. And I'll go, hi, a little bit more info. Most importantly, besides the dates, the name of the play, the director, and that stuff, who is the costume designer? Because the relationship between a hair and wig and costume designer is a unique relationship, much more so. I rep all sorts of designers, but I find that relationship, a lot of my costume designers go, we don't design from the neck down. So that's the most important thing, because I know there are some costume designers that Cookie would rather not necessarily work with, depending on the project or whatever. Other costume designers, in a heartbeat, Cookie will say yes before even reading a script. It's that relationship base. I always ask. I also always ask who the other designers are. Who's the lighting designer? Who's the, because you're creating this group of people that are making art. You sort of want to understand the dynamics of all the people that are joining that team. So it's important for Cookie mostly to know and it's Cookie is very much in demand on small projects and big projects, but you would be amazed how many times she's brought onto a project and there's no costume designer yet. It's a little bit odd. It's sort of like sometimes when a lighting designer is brought in before the set designer, because sort of sometimes there's that, path. But it's a testimony to Cookie and her work in the business and her relationships with people.
Cool. Okay, so that way, instead of Cookie having to ask all these follow-up questions, Russ, you get all the information.
Oh, absolutely.
All right, awesome. This next question is for Skyler. This is from Liam in North Carolina. What are the most common negotiation challenges you face on behalf of your designers, and how do you handle them? And that's just specifying that we're talking about theater designers, not performers or some directors, etc.
Great. I don't know if we have enough time to talk through all of the things that pop up. yes, the fees and the financials of it will always be a conversation. But I think the biggest things sort of fall into assistant fees, studio expenses, reimbursable expenses, housing. Does it have a kitchen? Is it walking distance? All the things that allow the human to create the art of the artist. We're able to rely sometimes a lot of contracts on the USA contract, which is the designer union. And especially if we're working with LORTs, they will lay out what those minimums are. But those are also minimum terms. And it's also assuming that it's one size fits all as a minimum. If you're working with a designer who has a child and they need to travel with the child, is there a childcare stipend? Do they need a 2-bedroom because they're bringing a significant other or someone to provide childcare? Accessibility needs, like all of those are things that are specific to the human and can be very, like you can be negotiating different designer agreements on the same show, and each designer will have a different need. I think a big part of it is not just assuming that whatever they did for the last contract, for the last show they did, is going to work for this show or for this designer. I think how we handle it is I worked in theaters for 10 years. Like I had the very conversations of like, this is actually what we can do, and this is physically what we can't do. But you also sometimes have to get creative to meet the needs of the artist, even if you don't have the budget to do it. What else are you able to do to allow them to do the work? And so I think a big part of it is just transparency, but it's not all a dollar amount. A lot of it really has to do with the needs of that artist and for that show, which might be different than the next show.
Okay, that's awesome. And I will say that I had a kid, my wife had a kid 18 months ago, and I started asking things like, oh, I need the mother who's breastfeeding this child to come with me. And I guess I was sort of surprised that theaters were like, okay, and they did work with me. And that's just something I had never even thought to ask. Okay, next question is for Daniela. This is from Olivia in Rhode Island. How do you prepare for contract negotiations to ensure your interests are represented effectively by your agent?
Yeah. I mean, like Skyler said, I don't know if I could really break it all down in this sort of amount of time, but it really starts with something that is like kind of a sad fact, which is our base level is just making sure that we're getting paid $25 an hour for the time that we are physically in tech, in system tunings, in rehearsals, physically present. So that's kind of where we start. I wish that number was higher. And, every now and then we will come across a job where those folks do go above that bare minimum, and we are able to up that to something like 32, which is great because at the end of the day, I can show up for a crew call and make more than my hourly rate as a designer. And, I can show up for a crew call and I can go home and not think about anything about sound design all night and be a human. Whereas I think, as we all know, with design, I'm thinking, I'm researching, I'm reading, not just the play, everything else over and over again. So that work is just different from an emotional labor perspective, I think. So that's like step one. Then we kind of take, okay, what else is left money-wise? And we put that to pre-production. And that's where Jack really comes in handy because he's able to, based on the fact that we've worked together for 3 years and like y'all said, really learned each other, he's able to ask questions like, what's the deal with the sound system? Is it a rep plot? Or are there things that, like a drawing that's accurate, that has all the speakers on it, and all you're going to have to do is add specials onto it, which is one end of the spectrum, or the other, which is like, are you completely bringing in a sound system from scratch? Are you bidding out to rental houses, 3, 4, 5 rental houses, getting substitutions, remodeling plots with spending hours in Vectorworks and modeling software, to the point where, that's a difference in, I would say, 10 to 40 hours of work, right? Being able to know that information, which is not always easy from every theater where inventories are either not updated or unclear, whatnot. Jack's able to help us kind of pinpoint that early on so that we're not getting into a show, 8 months in and saying, we have no money left to make content, which is the last and I would say the most important part of our negotiations that we work with Jack on, where There is a bit of a common misconception, I think, that there's just a lot of copyright-free content out there that is going to tell the story of your show in a nuanced and honestly culturally appropriate way. And it's just, I'm here to say it's not, or at least we're not the kind of designers that want to design with purely that. We understand why clauses like most favored nations come into play, but just like Cookie's situation with, how many wigs are we doing for this play? Is it 20 or is it 5? Is it going to be a 2-hour play where I'm underscoring original content for the entire play? Or is it a living room play where you need some door knocks and maybe like a honk in the distance, Like someone else said, it's not a cookie cutter thing per show, per production. Not to mention, a big thing we've been struggling with is we have the same base rate for certain size LORT theaters, whether we have 20 previews or 4 previews. And I just can't fathom how the day rate isn't more a part of, the base level of negotiation, and us not knowing when are we going to freeze and can we really set that in time so that I can tell you whether I can create original music for you or not under this budget that we have. There's so many more things like living like a human that Jack does for us. But I think those are really the big points for us that are specific to being sound designers that have been crucial for us to have an agent for. I don't know how we would be able to design and keep the producers honest on all of those points without an agent.
All right. This next question is for Russ. Can you share some strategies for negotiating better terms or conditions for your designers?
Sure. Well, let's use Cookie as an example, because Cookie is not in a union. She's not in Local 798. She's not in United Scenic Artists. She is not in a union. And it's a choice she's made successfully. So you get to a show, a big musical that was on Broadway with lots of stars, and they're going to capture the musical. Everybody's going to figure out what musical this is. I could talk about it was Merrily. And we repped a lighting designer, we repped Cookie, and we repped the makeup designer. So everybody knows United Scenic Artists will come in and help with the terms for the capture for the United Scenic Artist designers. So you sort of put that away. And I know what everybody's getting because I happen to have a lighting designer on the show. But then you've got Cookie, the hair and wig designer, with, you may not know how many wigs. There were a lot of wigs in that show. There were like,
by the end, close to 80.
Yeah. When you look at the show, you have no idea how many wigs are in the show. So I then get the offer from, and we had a makeup designer on the show also, who Cookie works with a lot. And we get the offer, and the offer is ridiculous. I look to the offer and I go, whoa, wait a second. This is nowhere near what the union designers are getting. And I go back to the producers and I go, I'm sorry, but you need to match what the United Scenic Artists are doing. Why? Well, because they are also contributors to the show and they've worked just as hard. And I don't think you're aware of how many wigs there are in this show and how much work Cookie has to do to prepare to get the wigs ready for high def capture, film lace, the whole bit. This took a while, and it happens a lot when we have non-union people on puppet designers get caught in that gray area. Composers when they're sound designers, but they're also doing original composition. So I try and piggyback. In that case, I piggybacked off the United Scenic Artists. We have a good relationship with them, and I said, "This is what you need to do." And if you don't want to do it, Cookie had a very good relationship with the director. She would be happy to talk to the director. I'd be happy to go to Local 798 and tell the crew not to support their hair and wig designer. Whatever you need to do. You don't want to play hardball in the beginning. You want to be nice. And you don't want to be rude. So you start with, well, how did you come up with that number? It's so low, right? You get that offer and you go, oh, whoa. My last designer, Santa Fe Opera, didn't get that. Why is this? And they have no answers. A lot of times they have no answers. They couldn't give me a concrete answer why they were giving Cookie that particular number. So I said, here's the number I propose based on what the other designers are getting. And ultimately, we got it, right, Cookie? We did it. It was team. was a teamwork. But when you go into difficult negotiations, Google is your friend, right? You always want to know who you're negotiating with. I had negotiated with that film company before, so I knew who they were. I had particular feelings about them. I knew what we were getting into, and we had the union as a backup. So I think you go in prepared. That's what you have to go. And also, I always say to Cookie, would you be okay if you only got 100% of your original deal? And she'll say, well, what do the other designers get? Well, 200%. Well, hell no, I want 200%. Are you willing to dig in a little bit with me and get a little dirt? And she'll go, yes, right? Because it's a team. You've got a village, a team. Your agent isn't on a pedestal, right? You need to sort of all. And we got what we needed on that one. It was a little tough. I don't know if that answered your question. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that was a lot. That's I'm like sitting here listening and I'm starting to get stressed out and like,
sorry.
Like I wouldn't like, it's a rough situation. Well, not rough, but it sounds stressful to me to deal with all that.
It's
but
fun.
I think you sound, it's fun. Okay. That's an interesting word. But I think you summed it up when you said go in prepared, be prepared and be a team. Because like all that other underlying work of what are the other unions doing and all this, you have to know all that and you have to come in to argue that. Yeah. Awesome. This next one is for Johanna from Emma in Austin. When negotiating contracts, how do you balance the need for good compensation with the desire to build relationships and secure future work?
So I was always taught that there are three things that I look for in any job, right? The first is compensation. The second is portfolio or relationships that come out of that job. And the third one is because this is art and what we do is art, is my personal artistic satisfaction, right? So there are three things that I should look for. And generally I try to find 2 out of 3 in every job that I take on. If I can't find 2 out of 3, hopefully the answer is no. If it's compensation's not the biggest thing that's on the table right now. And if I can get 3 out of 3, that's always the best. And then the fourth thing lately that I've added on too is that I use Lucy as a sounding board now that we started working together, right? Because then I'm like, Lucy, like, does it make sense for me to take this job? Should I be doing this? What do you think? Right. And it's so helpful to have a person who is going to be honest with you and who's going to just, tell you person to person, like, where do you think your career is going? Will this actually help make a difference? Or will it, are the 2 out of 3 things important enough that I should take this job even if it's not paying me enough money? And generally, so those conversations will happen back and forth. And when I say compensation too, I don't just mean like how much money I'm going to make, but like Skyler mentioned earlier, like it's compensation means a variety of things too. It's like, how much money is my assistant getting? Because more often than not, all of our agents are negotiating our assistant fees for us as well. And they don't get paid for that, which is really unfortunate. But that's a big part of what they do too, is making sure that we as designers are supported in the job that we're doing. And so all of these things kind of go part and parcel into the negotiation. And then from there, I try to figure out, like, is it worth doing? Is it not worth doing? I just kind of have to lay those 3 things out and talk through it with her or my partner.
That's awesome. And that fourth thing you've added, which doesn't make sense, I feel like that's something on this podcast we've come across a lot, which is like, what does your gut say? Okay, awesome. All right, so those are the questions. These next ones are just role play situations. And I realize these are going to be vague and might not make sense even. But I think it's really just more of seeing like where an agent's brain is at, where a designer's brain is at in situations like these. So we're going to start with early career designers. So Jack, starting with you, imagine you're representing an early career designer negotiating their first major project with a theater company. As an agent, how would you advise your designer to approach the discussion about compensation, credit, and other things? And how would you interact with the GM, producer, or the artistic director that you're negotiating with?
Yeah, a great question, because this is how Daniela and Uptown Works and I started working together when they were straight out of their Yale MFA program. The first thing is that some of these BFA and MFA programs, or all of them, don't really have classes as to like, what is industry standard? What does a contract look like? What does the union do? So I think that the first thing is a little bit of education, like sitting down with the designer for an hour, hour and a half and talking through, here's an example redacted contract from someone else at this theater. This is what you can expect to see. This is what is standard. This is what is not standard. And to just do a little bit of, I don't want to call it hand holding, but you're entering the industry. Let's have a soft entry. This is what is reasonable. This is what is not reasonable. I think we would have the sort of standard conversation that you have at any level, early, mid, upper career, of what do you need? Who do you need in the room? How much time do you need? Is it worth it? Labor versus money wise. I think that doesn't really change depending on the level that you're at. And then there's the conversation of your representative is going to be representative of you. So establishing with that person who's just entering the industry, do you want your agent to be more bullish and come in with a sort of tough guy behind a mahogany desk kind of attitude? Or do you want the person to come in with sort of a softer hand? It's really dependent upon the person. But I think sort of like what Russ was saying earlier, my initial impulse just as a person is to enter with kindness and to enter with respect. I think you always get more of what you want by being respectful and liked by the GM or the producer that you're working with. If they feel an onus to you because you've, taken them for a drink or been nice to them on the phone or whatever it may be, you're much more likely to get what you want. And it feels better to get what you want when you've done it in a nice, kind way.
That's fantastic. Jason, still sticking with the early career designer role play. As an early career designer, you're unsure about how to negotiate a lower than expected fee. How would you prepare for this conversation? And what key points would you make to your agent about your value and potential growth?
Ooh, I would say Skyler. No, I think it's funny. I always say a lot of designers ask me this question, and I think the first step is actually taking stock of what you need to do your best work. Like I was so eager to work and just like so excited about these contracts that I didn't even really know what I needed until it was kind of too late, right? It was like trying to juggle all these projects at the same time. And then I finally understood that, housing is actually quite significant for me and its proximity to the theater. And so I think if you have those sort of upfront conversations with your agent in the theater about, I actually need XYZ to produce the best work. And you just have that upfront conversation with the theater. I think times are a little different too, because especially before 2020, when we didn't have many of the conversations that we're having or we have had, like a lot of people just suffered, and including myself, right? I didn't advocate for anything because I didn't want to ruffle any feathers, right? And I think many young designers are in that position when they get that first Lord B contract. They're going to just take whatever the theater says because it's their first Lord B contract and they don't want to ruffle any feathers. But I think now we're at a time where we can have the conversation. I think about so many opportunities that I didn't take because I was like, I couldn't be there for the entire 15-week process, but I didn't have that conversation to say, oh, what is happening during that 15 weeks? And it's like, oh, half of that is just like staging rehearsals or the plot won't even be up by the time we start the tech process. So I really think, early career designers just need to have that conversation, like rip the Band-Aid off, because I hope theater's a little bit more receptive to it now with all the conversations that we've had over the last few years. But I think understanding what value you bring to the table is really important. I think it'll make it easier to have those conversations.
Yeah, I think that's great. Also, yeah, saying no to a contract before you sort of like ask for what you need, like that 15-week example of like at least go back and say, could I only be there for 10 weeks? And then, yes, it's all legwork. Everything takes work to figure that out, which I can definitely see the benefit of an agent helping with that legwork. All right, so now let's switch to mid-career designers. This is for Lucy here. You're working with a mid-career designer who has received an offer for a project that doesn't quite meet their usual fee. As an agent, how would you negotiate terms to reflect the designer's experience and value?
Yeah, I think you've nailed part of the answer in the question, which is that I think the first thing that I usually look at in looking at an offer is the context, both in terms of, what has this specific client received in the past for shows of a similar scale, but also what have I or other agents at my company received from this theater, this producer, or this GM in the past. So I typically start by doing my research and seeing, okay, this theater typically has not been willing to negotiate their fees, or, oh, I've actually had quite a good success in negotiating at this theater before, and get that context. And I think, yes, the context of actually this designer has typically received much higher fees at this level of show is also very important. And then I think I ask a lot of the questions that we've been discussing already on this Zoom. I will go to the client and say probably, hey, this is lower than normal. What is your background on this project? Is this one that you have a real desire to commit to no matter what because of one of the things Johanna mentioned, a director, an artistic fulfillment, whatever it is, and make sure I have all the background. And I think ultimately what usually ends up happening is I go back to the GM with all of the context I've just talked about of actually this designer typically gets a higher fee, and see what happens from there, and hope to have some success in negotiating. And if not, start to weigh everything else that we've been talking about here. What's the housing like? Is there assistant support? Is there a shop? All of those questions.
In the situations where you're like going up against the GM or theater that is not going to negotiate or play well, or you haven't had success with in the past, do you try, or how do you handle those situations?
Yeah, I think it's always good to ask the question, especially during the pandemic. There was a lot of conversation about most favored nations language, both as a tool for good and as a tool for evil. I think it can be both. I think it can both protect people and also be a really easy way for people to opt out of negotiating. But I think, yes, even if it's the theater that I know typically gives you a brick wall, it's sometimes good to say, okay, I know that you typically have fixed fees for your season, but this is a play that is entirely underscored by original music. And so this is a much bigger lift for this designer, or, whatever context it is. And I think, and I often say this to clients, even if in the short term asking the question doesn't make a difference, hopefully if in the long term a theater keeps hearing the same thing again and again, that can help to create some change.
I love that asking the question, because that's something that has been up on a lot of discussions in this show, which is like, we all have to continue asking the questions, or we all have to be pushing. Like, we want everybody to be asking for all the things, so that way it becomes more standard. And as an agent or a designer, you don't have to do so much legwork every time if it sort of becomes standard. All right, this next one is for Daniela. And Daniela, I think this is similar to the previous question you answered, so I apologize for that, but it's how life has worked today. As a mid-career designer, you're negotiating a contract that includes additional responsibilities outside your usual scope. What are the key factors you would discuss with your agent to ensure fair compensation and workload balance?
Yeah, no worries. My answer was so long earlier, I can do a different version of it. Honestly, I can provide a real world example, which is recently we were asked to a show. It very much includes all the things a sound designer has to do, which is build a system, including both outputs and microphones, as well as content to build the world, sound effects, etc. And then also on top of that, teach the student actors how to sing some songs, which is just absolutely not, the sound designer's job, nor was the theater expecting that per se. But, we did have to just kind of point out and delineate exactly which of those tasks needed to be under one contract, which was and is protected under most favored nations. So, that couldn't expand. So we have to figure out a way to have an entirely separate contract to do that labor of, what is essentially a music director for a straight play, or a straight play with music, which is not exactly, something with a lot of precedence. While we do a lot of those, and I think we're doing more of them, which is really cool. We're so used to being like a musical versus a play. So in all of these really interesting projects that we're able to do, where it's really kind of bridging the in-between, Jack is super helpful and helping us figure out how to advocate for additional money or an additional entirely separate contract in order to achieve those things. I think that is a good example of the question.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. Now we're going to switch into high-profile projects. Cookie, as a high-profile designer, you're being offered a project with unusual contract terms. How would you work with your agent to address these issues while maintaining professional relationships and securing the best outcome?
Well, I'm in the middle of one right now. And I always say talk to my agent. For example, being a hair, wig, makeup designer, and you're doing a show with high profile people, but there are no wigs. So they think that they should pay you less or no wigs, right? But what Russ knows, and I know, it's going to cost them more money in the end because we cannot budget what happens to people's own hair. These high profile clients will request certain things that if they just wore a wig, we know it's that amount of money, done. So I talk to Russ and I'll say, Russ, can we please let them know that this is not the most efficient way to use their money, and that they have to have these high profile people. So you won't be able to hire someone to run that show for $23 an hour. If they're all film and TV people, there's an expectation of what goes on in that room when they use their own hair. I am willing to take, if it's true, truly no wigs. And my thing is, I say to Russ, if it's truly no wigs, sure, this offer is great. But as soon as there's a wig involved, we go back to the table. That's what I do. And then I go, Russ, go.
Okay. All right. So
can I add? I want to add one other thing. Cookie has worked with so many actors through the years. She knows which actors will never wear their own hair. She will know when she looks at the cast list that that particular actor will always want a wig, regardless of what the GM or the producer's saying. The minute Cookie has a one-on-one session, a design session with that actor, it's done. We have to go back to the GM and say, nope, we told you this person wants a wig.
And this
right?
is the thing that's happening with this is that I don't want to be the person who gives them the bad news of, using your own hair. So I've asked Russ to ask those people, has the producers and GMs told these actors that this is what we want to do? And now that I've done that, the answer is coming back, no, they haven't told them that.
So in these situations, I guess at the first negotiating, do you just sort of let it play out and do the first negotiating and then renegotiate when things change? Or do you sort of forewarn and say, we can do this, but it's not going to play out this way? Does that make sense?
Yeah, we have a contingency plan. We definitely do. Because the other thing that happens with cooking, unfortunately, is haircuts, men's haircuts. It's an ongoing thing. Are you going to bring somebody in? Is the person who's running the show licensed to do haircuts? It gets, just because it's their own hair doesn't necessarily mean they're saving money. So yeah, we'll start and we'll go, okay, this fee is great. We understand, this is how many weeks Cookie needs for an assistant. You're still going to need X amount of people to run the show because is their hair going to be curled? Is it going to be straightened? Is it are they diving into a pool? What's happening here? And then we get the contract done, but we're very clear in writing that the scope of work will be revisited. That's the touchy part, especially with all designers. You don't really know the scope of work at first. You might read the script, but until you sort of get into the design discussions, you just really don't know is there original music? Does somebody cut their ear off on stage and they're bleeding? How many GMs have read a script and have said to me and Cookie, oh, it's basic makeup, just lipstick and eyeshadow. And we'll read the script and we'll go, what? There's tattoos, there's scars, there's pockmarks. And I'll go back to did anybody in the office read the script? Well, can't all that stuff be done backstage? No, you talk to the writer and the director. It says these things happen on stage. So we go in with an understanding of a scope of work, being open to revisiting the scope of work. And with Cookie, it's harder because, as you said, there's a LORT B minimum. There are minimums. There's an off-Broadway minimum. We don't have minimums. We make up our own minimums.
Awesome. Okay. I'm going to jump to Skyler for another high profile thing. So you're working with a high profile designer being offered a prestigious project with significant media attention. As an agent, how would you approach negotiating the terms to reflect the designer's experience level and the high demands of the project?
I mean, I think in basic terms, I approach it the same way I approach any deal, which is very much like what is actually this project asking for? I think what starts to expand pretty quickly is the scale, especially when you're getting into commercial projects, Broadway projects. Like the scale just quickly multiplies. And a part of that goes into, if you're working at a LORT theater, you might be talking about an assistant fee. The minute you're talking about a Broadway project for a costume designer, you're talking about an associate, an assistant, if not two assistants, a shopper. There might be a sketch artist. Like it just starts to expand. And that's true with studio space. Like where are fittings going to happen? Where are you storing the costumes? What does all of that look like? Because it's not in a designer's apartment. This is not what we're doing. And the scale of those also have to match the project. I think what also quickly changes is when you're working out on projects of a massive scale that have a lot of media attention, you have to think like 5 productions later because they're likely going to want to do a tour and a transfer, and there's different territories, and they might want to do an out of town. And it really, you have to be about 20 steps beyond just the terms of that first production. Because especially if you're working like in the UK and, they're not bound by the same union mandate, what are they trying to build in for a transfer? And are you actually hurting yourself before you even get there by agreeing to something that sounds good in theory? That's part of it. Also with designers at a certain level, if you're wanting to hire that person, but you want to offer them $15,000 less than what their last show was, you're very likely hiring them because of what they were able to do on the last show. But now you want the same product, or you want the same, expertise for a very different fee. That's actually not how it's usually going to work, because a designer has built that up. And also, if that's what you want on that massive musical and you're hiring them for a massive musical, the needs might even be more so, especially when you really get into like your non-negotiables as a designer. It's very easy to say, this is what they're going to need in order to make this project happen. And sometimes it works and sometimes they're not able to offer that, and the designer says, then I can't do that. Like, I'm not putting myself in that situation where I'm expected to deliver the same thing I did in terms of scale for half the money, half the support. It's actually going to be more detrimental, both as a human, but also that's their product on stage and people will go see them. That is also what people get to know you for. So I think all of that is wrapped in, you're just working at a much higher scale. And so those needs are just going to multiply. But the approach to it is still the same. What does this project need and what are you being asked to do?
Yeah. And you were mentioning thinking 5 projects ahead or 20 steps ahead. And Russ earlier mentioned, get stuff in writing early on so that we can then have something to work from. In situations like that, are you getting stuff in writing early on, or are you just you and the designer saying, okay, this is how we're approaching this, and we will keep in mind XYZ for the future?
I think it depends on the project. I think the bottom line is getting a right of first refusal, and what does that actually encapsulate? What territories are we actually talking about? Especially if you're working on projects of a certain level, like North America is not the end goal. It is one of the goals. But if the right of first refusal is limited to that and it's going to the UK, what have you actually sort of built in? So getting that in writing, of course, but also they might do it here in the States, and then when they transfer it, they want it to be twice as big because it's going into a much larger theater. So also saying, I want the exact same thing may actually not equate to the work at hand. So a part of that is to negotiate it when you actually know what's being asked. Every GM office is also different, but again, what you feel comfortable agreeing to and what you're willing to put in writing is dependent on designer and dependent on the project.
Okay, awesome. All right, so I have one final question for everyone. What is one piece of advice you wish you knew before you got an agent to negotiate for you, / before you started negotiating for agents? And I'm going to go same order as I went at the top. So starting with Daniela.
Yeah. I think the thing I'm learning, so I'm still teaching myself, so giving this to myself, is like, it's really tempting to say, well, we haven't even had design conversations yet. We haven't even met with the design team. I haven't really even been introduced to the director yet. I just got hired. And to say, we'll figure it out later. Russ was quite accurate in that a lot of folks aren't even reading the script, and there's a lot of things that if you don't do the early work, it will be really, really hard to figure out how to renegotiate later. Force yourself to read that script, to make even a rough list of like, what are the elements of this play that this production bare minimum needs based on the script that I do not trust that anyone else has read. And, make that meeting with the director just to even put them on your side to understand, like, I can give you this if the scope is this. And that way they're able to help you advocate later for that extra budget for materials or that extra composition fee, even though, the theater is like, oh, this is 12 months from now. Do that early work with your agent on those early bare parameters without trusting that other people have already thought about that.
Awesome. Jack, what's something you wish you had known before you started negotiating for agent or for designers?
When I first started out, often there's this sort of manufactured sense of urgency in negotiations. Like theaters really push you to get something done by a certain date, or there's this sort of sense that it's all got to get done quickly. And I think when I first started out, I missed things or left money on the table or, didn't get the best terms I possibly could because I was so wrapped up in getting something done quickly. A huge lesson that I learned is that there is no such thing as a Broadway emergency. There is nothing that cannot wait. We're not doing brain surgery or rocket science. Like, we're making plays. It should be play. Everyone can take a breath. And I think that is the most effective, healthy way to not only to move through negotiations, but just to move through this industry, to go about it with a sense of play and kindness and all of that kind of thing.
Awesome. Jason, what's something that you wish you had known?
I will always default to have the conversation and ask the questions and be transparent about what you need and why you need it. It'll save 1,000 emails, first of all. And, I also say like the general management team has probably heard it before, like the request you're making. So like, say it, it's just, it's probably going to be, a little bit less or bigger, whatever, than what you're asking for. But I think there's no new idea that I feel like that has come out within the last 10 years that general management hasn't heard. So if you feel like you need it, say it. I will always default to that.
Awesome. Skyler.
The ability to just pick up the phone. The amount of times that you just are able to talk with another human on that level and be like, this is actually what we need to get to. How do we make that happen? One, saves you like 30 emails. But two, it's like, then you can have a common goal and it's just how you get there. And a lot of theaters are willing, once they understand what the need is, to, work with you to find a solution. It's very easy to just send emails and be the agent who's like asking for more. But like, that's not always the case. Sometimes, financially we're getting those up, but like, especially if we all understand what the end goal is, then they can work with you to find a solution. So I wish I would have just picked up the phone a lot earlier and not be afraid to actually have that not in writing and then follow up in writing with what you discussed once you actually problem solve the thing.
All right, Johanna, something you wish you had known before you got an agent to negotiate for you.
I think that it's not as daunting as you think it is, like trying to find an agent, because I feel like mine just turned out to be a friend that I had met like early on, and that it's really nice to be removed from the negotiating picture. That like not being to have to be the person that has to talk to general management about money straight away is kind of the most magical thing that's happened in my career, honestly.
Fantastic. Lucy.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say this to young Lucy starting out, or to a designer looking for an agent, quite frankly, that there's no formula. Yes, there are questions that I'm asking more often than not. A lot of, almost every time I'll be asking about an assistant or right of first refusal, there are certain asks that are more common than others. But really, it is each show is different, each client is different, and your priorities are what you want them to be. And having that open communication between agent and client and knowing what your common goals are and knowing what you are willing to go to the line on and what you're not, those are all really important and do make every negotiation different. And I think that's what I hope all agents and clients will know in their relationships with each other, that your ability to creatively problem solve is going to be dependent on whether you know what your common goals are. And there really is no formula to how we do our job. There is room to figure out solutions that someone may not have figured out before, but it is dependent on you being able to talk to each other and know what you're fighting for.
All right, Cookie, what's something that you wish you had known before you had Russ negotiate for you?
Or anybody negotiate. I wish I had known that I had realized that my work is only as good as the people who are doing it. In my contracts now, I get the final say on who's that week supervisor. Because a lot of these GMs have a Rolodex of WIC supervisors that they've used, and it always comes down to the ones they paid the least to, and the skills are not that good. And I learned this from my mentor, Tom Watson. He said, Cookie, that hair is as good as the person who's running that show. I mean, I can design something beautiful, but it's not like a costume where it is done. You keep it clean, you zip it up, you button it, it makes her totally different. And so I wish I'd known that, because in the beginning, there's some sad stuff out there for me. But I know that those wigs on the block were beautiful. But then we did the tag and stuff, and I would leave and come back, and I'd be like horrified. And it's like, I wish I'd known that earlier. It saves me a lot of, I don't cry, a lot of cussing.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And also you saying that because apparently I knew nothing about wigs before today's conversation, but all these little random things you've mentioned are just reminding me that everything's negotiable. Everything can go into the contract. Like there's so much more aside from the fee. And like Jason was saying, like ask for it. Like if it's even on your mind, just say it out loud, because somebody else said all the GMs have probably heard this before. So yeah, that's something that I'm not necessarily thinking about. Russ, what about you? Something you wish you'd known before you jumped in and started negotiating for designers?
I agree with everybody. Picking up the phone, kindness, all of that. When I started negotiating, I always assumed that the people that I was negotiating with were as smart as I was, that they had all the skills and all the understanding. I was young and naive, if I'm negotiating with these big deal people, they should have the same understanding of the business that I do. Well, guess what? How many people have we negotiated that don't? Even to this day, recently, I was negotiating with a GM, Broadway GM, and I was tag teaming with two other agents on this particular project. And I said, come on, guys, they can't be that stupid. Look at this. They can't be that stupid. Look at this offer. And one of the agents who I adore, who's a friend, verbally slapped me and he said, Ross, stop giving them the benefit of the doubt. They are that stupid. They just are. Just let it go. Assume they're that stupid and move on. And to this day, I still start my negotiations with respect and knowledge. I'm not going to teach you how to do your job. I assume you know how to do your job. I'm going to do my job, and we're going to do it together. But as I've moved in my career, I'm sort of letting go a little bit more of that and understanding that, and especially after COVID, right? A lot of people left the business. People went into film and TV. A lot of the general managers were scurrying to hire people because we had that onset of 1 million Broadway shows opening, commercial off Broadway, in a short period of time, and they couldn't find people to company manage, to do all those things that needed to be done. So people were just being thrown to the wolves. It was horrible. We're always very kind to those people. No, the royalty was for week ending 9/17, not April 17. No, that was a prorated week. No. So kindness. If somebody's kind, we'll be kind to them. We'll walk them through what is a project-only agreement, right? You deal with all these companies. But some of these people that sort of make believe they know what they're doing, and you kind of buy into it, at some point, you have to step back and go, maybe they don't really understand what a wig and hair designer does. Let me kind of explain to you why there are 80 some odd wigs in Maryland and what it takes to maintain those wigs. Listen, when I started, sound design was not really a thing. Projection designers, right? The bastard children of, right? Then you've got the hair and wig design, makeup designers, puppet designers. So we're all learning together in this new world also. So respect, kindness, pick up the phone. Yes, all of those things. Fabulous.
I love it. That's great. And I also feel like, again, that goes back to Jason's point of just ask for it. Because frankly, if you're assuming somebody knows and they're making a sensical offer, maybe they don't actually know. And you actually do have to say like, well, I need a production electrician to hang the lights, please, or something like that. I don't know. Okay, awesome. All right. All of you, thank you so much for doing this. This was phenomenal, fantastic. It was so grounded. I appreciate all of you so much. So meeting adjourned. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Amazing.
Thanks.
Bye, Cookie. Love you.
Love you, Ethan.
Goodbye. Thank you. Love you, Cookie.
Bye.
And Russ. That's it for this week's episode. My takeaways are: be prepared and organized. Russ said, Google is your friend. Know what other designers are getting paid, know industry standards, and present that all clearly and with kindness. It's a lot of work, but the more you know, the more leverage you have. Related to that, Daniela mentioned designers outlining their needs. So the hours required, the assistant fees, housing, and production specific needs, outlining those before entering into negotiations. So that way agents can use that info to advocate effectively. Or I think it was Sky that said, seldom is it a rush job. So take the time to get those details when you are negotiating. Cookie talked about letting the agent do the dirty work so that the designer can do the artistic work. Now, I think this is a huge reason why theater designers want agents, but also note that Cookie is not afraid to play hardball. She knows what she wants, she's confident, and she's willing to walk away. Now, Russ tossed out playing hardball is not the preferred thing to do, but you do sometimes have to get a little dirty to get a fair deal. Meeting an agent, or at least pairing up with one. So a lot of the panel met their agents through working together, but some of them were cold reach outs. Just saying that if you're looking to get an agent, or if you're an agent looking to get a designer, cold reach out can happen. Balancing compensation and relationships. Johanna mentioned projects requiring trade-offs between compensation, portfolio growth, or artistic satisfaction. And if at least 2 out of the 3 of those are met, the project may be worth taking on. And I loved her 4th one, which was, does it make sense? Or does it make sense for me? Skyler mentioned various needs like childcare, accessibility, and compensation for assistance, that those things can be non-negotiable, but they vary from designer to designer. hence why it's challenging to discuss things like this in a one-size-fits-all talking point. But what I take away from that is, what do you need to complete the design? Ask for it and say it out loud. That's advice that Jason echoed. Communicate your needs up front. It isn't considered ruffling feathers. Just have the discussion. Lucy mentioned using a designer's experience and past successes to justify better terms. And that's just a reminder to get working and get your track record started. And my last takeaway is that Skyler mentioned thinking 10 productions ahead. Now, this has never crossed my mind because I've never been on a project that was headed for greatness, but this is certainly what a good agent will do. Anticipate the expanded responsibilities you might have and the out-of-country transfers, and fair compensation with all that work. So that's all I have. Now, for each of these guests, you can find contact information and social media links in the show notes or at artisticfinance.com/176. And you can also find a link to the Patreon page of this episode, which includes that classroom supplement PDF, which is pros and cons of working with an agent. Now, we've reached the end of the episode, but don't be too upset because, of course, I will be back next week in my quest to find valuable information and conversations that can help us navigate our life and careers. But before we part ways, let me mention that there is a fee for listening to this show, and that fee is to tell somebody about Artistic Finance. So whether that be mentioning us on social media or texting this episode to a designer or agent in your life, share it however you feel comfortable doing. And then if paying the fee isn't enough and you want to help me out even more, consider becoming a patron of the show. Specifically, if you have benefited from Artistic Finance, whether it's negotiating better pay, managing the freelance life, or hearing real stories from theater people like you, consider supporting me on Patreon. For a few bucks a month, you get to help keep these conversations going, and you get access to bonus content, early releases, and an ad-free podcast feed. So if you've ever had a thought like, thanks, Ethan, for trying to help me navigate this crazy industry, and if you would be willing to ostensibly buy me a coffee once a month, I would love to have you in the Artistic Finance patron circle. And you can do that by visiting patreon.com/artisticfinance. But certainly no obligation. Now, the dad joke to end the episode, and I know you're thinking, is he ever going to stop saying dad jokes? But here's the thing. Once a dad, always a dad. But anyway, the dad joke to end the episode. Why don't theatrical agents ever tell bad jokes? Because they negotiate for scripts with the best punchlines. That's it for today. Until next time, break a leg.
Thank you for listening to Artistic Finance, where we interview successful artists, leaders, and investors to help educate and inspire the creative community. To access our show notes and resources, go to artisticfinance.com. This show is for entertainment purposes only. Before making any decision, consult a professional. This show is copyrighted by Artistic Finance. Written permission must be granted before syndication or rebroadcasting.